Owen Briggs would never forget the moment his father-in-law decided to define his worth in front of an entire room. It was Thanksgiving, the kind of gathering where laughter was supposed to come easily and family bonds were meant to feel warm. Instead, Owen sat at the long dining table, surrounded by polished silverware and people who wore wealth as if it were a badge of honor. Across from him, Vance Thornberry, his father-in-law, leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of expensive wine as he spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "A man's worth," Vance said with a smirk, "is measured by the weight of his wallet." The table erupted in laughter. Not polite laughter, not awkward chuckles, but genuine amusement, as if he had just delivered the cleverest line of the night. Owen forced a small smile and looked down at his plate, carefully slicing his turkey as if nothing had happened. But inside, something twisted. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, some amused, others dismissive, none of them kind. No one defended him, not his mother-in-law with her carefully practiced politeness, not his brother-in-law who hid arrogance behind lazy grins, and not even his wife, who sat quietly beside him, saying nothing at all. That silence hurt the most. From the very beginning, Owen had known he didn't belong in the Thornberry world. They were a family built on money, status, and appearances, owners of dealerships, investors, people who spoke in numbers and measured success in millions. Owen, on the other hand, worked with his hands. He restored old furniture, breathing life back into forgotten pieces, finding beauty where others saw only decay. It was honest work, meaningful work. But to them, it was insignificant. To them, he was insignificant. Every visit to their home felt like stepping onto a stage where he had already been cast as the failure. The comments came disguised as jokes, as concern, as casual observations that cut deeper than outright insults. Vance would ask about his little projects, with a grin that made it clear he didn't take Owen seriously. Lorene would mention the successful husbands of her friends, doctors, lawyers, executives, her tone sweet but her meaning sharp. Hollis would laugh openly, calling Owen the repairman, like it was a title beneath dignity. And still, Owen endured. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself that love was enough, that as long as his wife stood by him, the opinions of her family meant nothing. But as the years passed, even that belief began to crack. Because the truth was, in that house, at that table, and in every glance thrown his way, Owen wasn't seen as a man. He was seen as a disappointment, someone who had married into a world he would never be worthy of, at least not by their standards. So he stayed quiet. He swallowed the humiliation, buried the anger, and carried on. For them, it was just another joke, another harmless remark. But for Owen, it was the beginning of 8 long years of being made to feel like he was nothing at all. For the next 8 years, Owen did what he had always believed was the right thing. He endured. He told himself that not every battle needed to be fought, that dignity sometimes meant staying silent when others tried to provoke you. So he swallowed every insult, every sideways glance, every quiet laugh that followed him out of rooms. Holidays became something he learned to brace for rather than enjoy. Birthdays, anniversaries, casual Sunday dinners, each gathering with the Thornberry family, carried the same familiar tension, the same unspoken understanding that Owen would be the smallest man in the room, no matter how hard he worked or how deeply he loved. The comments never stopped. If anything, they became more refined, more subtle, as if his in-laws had perfected the art of cutting him down without ever appearing openly cruel. Vance would ask about his business in that same mocking tone, disguising contempt as curiosity. "Still fixing old chairs?" he would say, raising an eyebrow as if the idea itself was amusing. Lorene would sigh softly during conversations about finances, reminding Dia within Owen's hearing how important it was for a woman to feel secure in her future. Hollis didn't bother with subtlety at all. He laughed openly, making jokes about Owen's clothes, his truck, his work, his entire way of life. At first, Dia had been different. In those early years, she would squeeze Owen's hand under the table when her father spoke, a silent apology wrapped in warmth. She would defend him when things went too far, her voice firm, her loyalty clear. She would remind him later, in private moments, that she loved him for who he was, not for what he had. Those moments had been enough to keep him going. They had been the reason he believed he could withstand everything else. But time has a way of wearing people down, especially when they are caught between two worlds. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Dia began to change. The hand squeezes became less frequent. The defenses grew quieter, less certain. Eventually, they disappeared altogether. Where she had once spoken up, she now remained silent. Where she had once met his eyes with reassurance, she now avoided his gaze entirely. Owen noticed it in the smallest ways. The way she would shift slightly away from him at family gatherings, as if distance could protect her from association. The way her laughter began to blend with the others when Hollis made his jokes. The way she stopped asking about his work, stopped showing interest in the things that once fascinated her. Conversations between them grew shorter, thinner, until silence filled the spaces where love had once lived. At home, the distance became impossible to ignore. They moved around each other like strangers sharing the same walls. Nights that used to be filled with quiet conversations and shared dreams turned into separate routines, separate thoughts, separate lives. When Owen tried to reach her, to ask what had changed, she would brush it off with a simple "nothing," or walk away before the conversation could begin. It wasn't anger that replaced her love. It was something colder, indifference, and that hurt more than anything her family had ever said. Owen began to question himself in ways he never had before. Maybe they were right. Maybe he wasn't enough. Maybe love wasn't supposed to feel like this constant uphill climb, this endless need to prove his worth to people who had already decided he had none. He worked harder, took on more projects, pushed himself to exhaustion, hoping that if he could just do more, be more, earn more, something would shift. That Dia would see him again the way she once had. That her family would finally acknowledge him as something other than a mistake. But no matter how much he gave, it was never enough. Little by little, the man who had once believed in the quiet strength of who he was began to shrink under the weight of who others said he wasn't. The confidence in his craft remained, but his sense of self, his place in his own life, started to erode. He still loved Dia. That never changed. But love, he was beginning to learn, could not survive on one side alone. By the end of those 8 years, Owen wasn't just enduring the Thornberry family anymore. He was enduring the silence in his own marriage, the absence of the one person he thought would always stand beside him. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet realization began to take root, one he wasn't ready to face yet, but one that would soon change everything. Love, no matter how strong, could not make someone stay who had already begun to leave. While the Thornberry family measured success in luxury cars, investment portfolios, and million-dollar deals, Owen measured his days in something far quieter: progress you could touch with your hands. His workshop sat behind a modest garage on the edge of town, a space filled with the scent of sawdust, varnish, and time itself. It wasn't impressive to the outside world. There were no polished floors or glass offices, no assistants or business suits. Just worn tools, sturdy workbenches, and pieces of furniture that most people had already given up on. But to Owen, that place meant everything. He was a furniture restoration craftsman, a trade he had learned years ago from his Uncle Clement. Where others saw broken chairs, scratched tables, and forgotten antiques, Owen saw stories waiting to be brought back to life. Every piece that came into his workshop carried history, family dinners, childhood memories, generations of use, and he treated each one with a kind of quiet respect. He would spend hours sanding down rough edges, carefully matching wood grains, restoring finishes layer by layer until something old and damaged became whole again. There was no shortcut in his work, no quick profit, just patience, skill, and pride. And that was something the Thornberrys could never understand. To them, Owen's job was small, almost laughable. They saw the dust on his clothes, the simplicity of his tools, the modest income his craft provided, and they judged him accordingly. They believed success had to look expensive to be real, that if something didn't come with a high price tag, it wasn't worth much at all. But Owen knew better. He knew what it meant to take something discarded and give it purpose again. He knew the satisfaction of stepping back after hours of work and seeing not just a finished piece but a story preserved. He knew the quiet pride of earning every dollar honestly, without shortcuts or pretense. His work didn't just restore furniture, it restored meaning, both for the people who brought those pieces to him and for himself. In many ways, his life was simple. He drove an old truck that rattled when it started, wore clothes that prioritized comfort over appearance, and lived in a house that was modest but warm. There were no grand displays of wealth, no need to impress anyone. What he had was enough. And yet, in the eyes of his wife's family, enough was the same as nothing. That contrast followed him everywhere. At family gatherings, he would listen as conversations revolved around stock markets, luxury vacations, and high-end purchases, all spoken with an ease that came from never having to worry about cost. He would sit quietly, knowing he had nothing to contribute to those discussions, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he lived in a completely different world. A world where value wasn't measured in numbers, but in effort, in care, in the ability to create something real. For a long time, Owen believed that difference didn't matter. He believed that a good life didn't need to look impressive to be meaningful, and deep down, he still believed it. But being surrounded by people who constantly told him otherwise began to blur that certainty. Their voices, their judgments, their constant reminders of what he didn't have, they crept into his thoughts in ways he didn't want to admit. Not enough, not successful, not worthy. Still, every morning he returned to his workshop, because in that space, none of those voices mattered. In that space, he knew exactly who he was. Long before Owen ever stepped into the Thornberry family's world of wealth and judgment, there was one person who shaped the way he saw life: his uncle, Clement. If the Thornberrys represented everything loud, polished, and outwardly impressive, Clement was the complete opposite. He lived alone in a quiet cabin deep in the woods, surrounded by silence and simplicity. His clothes were always the same flannel shirts, worn jeans, boots that had seen better days, and his truck sounded like it might give up at any moment. But there was something about him that commanded a different kind of respect. Not the kind you demanded, but the kind you earned without ever asking for it. When Owen was younger, he spent summers with Clement, learning not just how to work with wood, but how to see the world differently. Clement never rushed anything. He would stand beside Owen, guiding his hands as he sanded down rough surfaces, teaching him patience, precision, and the quiet satisfaction of doing something well. "Don't just fix it," he would say. "Understand it." Those lessons stayed with Owen long after the summers ended. In many ways, they became the foundation of the man he would grow into. Clement was never a man who explained himself fully. He spoke in short sentences, often leaving meaning hanging in the air for Owen to figure out on his own. So when Owen turned 18, and Clement handed him a small black card, it felt like just another one of his quiet mysteries. The card was unlike anything Owen had ever seen. Matte black, heavier than it should have been, with no logo, no numbers, no bank name, nothing but a single name engraved in silver: Clement Farrow. It didn't look like a credit card, and it didn't look like something ordinary people carried. Owen turned it over in his hands, confused. "What is this for?" he asked. Clement looked at him with that same calm, knowing expression he always had, as if he were seeing something Owen couldn't yet understand. "Keep it with you," he said simply. "Don't use it unless you truly need it." Owen frowned, waiting for more. There had to be more. But Clement just added one final sentence, the kind that lingered long after it was spoken. "When you do use it, they'll know exactly who you are." Owen didn't understand what that meant, not then. He asked questions, tried to push for an explanation, but Clement only smiled and shook his head, as if the answer wasn't something that could be given too early. Eventually, Owen stopped asking. He slipped the card into his wallet and carried it with him, more as a keepsake than anything else. A strange, weighty reminder of a man he deeply respected. Years passed. Life moved on. Clement grew older, quieter, and eventually he was gone. When Owen lost his uncle, it felt like losing the one person who had ever truly seen him without judgment. The cabin fell silent. The lessons became memories, and the black card remained untouched, unexplained. He kept it not because he believed it held power, but because it was the last piece of Clement he could carry with him every day. Sometimes, on quiet nights, Owen would take it out and look at it, turning it between his fingers, wondering if there was something he had missed. But life had a way of demanding attention elsewhere. Bills to pay, work to finish, a marriage slowly slipping through his hands, there was never a moment that felt like the one Clement had described, a moment of true need. So the card stayed where it had always been, tucked safely in his wallet, waiting. What Owen didn't realize, what he couldn't have possibly known, was that Clement had never been a man of empty gestures. Every word he spoke, every object he left behind, carried meaning far deeper than it seemed. The card was not just a mystery, it was a key. And when the time finally came for Owen to use it, it wouldn't just answer questions. It would change everything. The restaurant was everything Owen had always expected, and everything he had always known he didn't belong to. The Winthrop stood glowing in the cold December night, its tall windows spilling warm golden light onto the snow-covered streets. Inside, crystal chandeliers hung from impossibly high ceilings, casting reflections across polished marble floors. Every surface gleamed, every detail whispered luxury. The kind of place where even silence felt expensive. Owen stepped in beside Dia, suddenly aware of every imperfection, the slight wear on his shoes, the simplicity of his shirt, the way his hands, rough from years of work, didn't seem to belong in a room like this. But Dia didn't look at him. She walked ahead, poised and distant, as if they had arrived separately. The private dining room was already filled. 42 people sat around a long, elegantly set table, all connected by blood, marriage, or business, to the Thornberry name. Conversations flowed easily. Talk of investments, new properties, luxury vacations. Laughter rose and fell like background music. But when Owen entered, something shifted. Not silence, just a subtle change, the kind that made it clear he was being noticed, measured, and quietly dismissed. He took his seat beside Dia. She didn't acknowledge him. Dinner began as it always did, fine food, polished conversation, and the occasional remark, carefully crafted to remind Owen where he stood. Vance sat at the head of the table like a king, his presence commanding attention without effort. At one point, he turned toward Owen, his lips curling into that familiar, mocking smile. "So, Owen," he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "how's the furniture repair business? Still holding on?" A few people chuckled. Owen nodded slightly. "It's steady." "Steady," Vance repeated, swirling his wine. "That's a nice way of saying you're getting by." He leaned back, amused. "I was just speaking with a friend whose son-in-law bought a $4 million house last month, paid in cash. Makes you think about what real success looks like, doesn't it?" Laughter followed, softer this time, but no less cutting. Owen lowered his gaze to his plate, focusing on something, anything that wasn't the weight of their judgment. He had learned how to survive moments like this. Stay quiet, don't react, let it pass. But tonight, something felt different. The air was heavier, the distance beside him colder. And then, without a word, Dia reached into her purse. The motion was small, almost insignificant, but it pulled Owen's attention immediately. She placed a white envelope on the table in front of him and slid it across the linen tablecloth. Her movements were calm, deliberate, final. Owen frowned slightly. "What is this?" "Open it," she said, her voice flat, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond him. He hesitated for just a second before picking it up. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Inside were several documents, neatly organized. He didn't need to read far. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The words blurred for a moment as his mind struggled to catch up with reality. He looked at Dia, searching for something: confusion, regret, anything that suggested this wasn't what it seemed. "You're divorcing me?" he asked quietly. "I've already made my decision," she replied, her tone cold, detached. "I should have done this years ago." The words didn't just land, they echoed. Through his chest. Through everything he had tried to hold together for so long. Before he could respond, Vance stood, raising his glass with theatrical pride. "Well," he announced, his voice booming across the room, "it's about time." He glanced at Owen with open satisfaction. "My daughter has finally come to her senses." A ripple of approval moved through the table. Vance lifted his glass higher. "Let's be honest, this was inevitable. A woman like Dia deserves a future. Stability. Not," he gestured vaguely toward Owen, "whatever this has been." Laughter followed. Louder now. Freer. "And Owen," Vance continued, his grin widening, "I'll give you until February to collect your things. After that, I assume you'll figure something out. Though," he paused for effect, "I imagine the street isn't too crowded this time of year." A few people clapped. Then more joined in. And suddenly, it wasn't just laughter anymore. It was applause. 40 people, raising their glasses, smiling, celebrating as if they had just witnessed something worthy of praise, as if the destruction of a man's life was entertainment. Owen sat there, completely still. The sound filled the room, echoing off the walls, pressing in from every direction. He could see their faces, some amused, some indifferent, some simply following along. He saw Hollis laughing openly, Lorene smiling with quiet satisfaction, and Dia still not looking at him. Not once. That was the moment it broke. Not the papers, not the words, not even the humiliation. It was the realization that the person he had loved, the one he had endured everything for, was sitting inches away and treating him like he no longer existed. The applause slowly faded, conversations beginning to resume as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But for Owen, everything had changed. He looked down at the papers in his hands, then slowly folded them, placing them into his jacket pocket with careful precision. His movements were calm now, too calm, because somewhere deep inside, past the hurt, past the anger, past the years of silence, something had finally shifted. And for the first time in a very long time, Owen was no longer willing to stay quiet. The applause faded, but something inside Owen did not. It didn't explode into anger or break into grief, it settled. Cold, clear, certain. For 8 years, he had absorbed every insult, every laugh, every quiet dismissal, telling himself that silence was strength. But sitting there, with divorce papers in his pocket, and 40 people already moving on as if he no longer mattered, he realized something he had refused to see before. His silence had not protected his dignity. It had only made him invisible. He lifted his eyes and looked around the table, really looked this time. These were people who had already decided his worth long before this night. People who believed money defined everything, including the right to respect someone. And for the first time, Owen didn't feel small under their gaze. He felt done. A waiter approached, quietly collecting plates, unaware that the atmosphere at the table had shifted in a way no one could yet see. Owen raised his hand slightly. "Excuse me," he said. The waiter turned, polite and composed. "Yes, sir?" Owen's voice was calm, steady, almost too steady. "I'd like to pay for the table, all of it." There was a brief pause, just long enough for the words to register. Then came the laughter. It started with Hollis, a sharp, incredulous laugh that quickly spread across the table. Vance leaned back in his chair, shaking his head in amusement. "Did you hear that?" he said loudly. "Owen wants to pay. That's a good one." A few people chuckled. Others smirked, exchanging looks that said the same thing. This was pathetic. The waiter hesitated, unsure whether to take the request seriously. "Sir, this is a party of 42. The bill will be quite substantial." "I understand," Owen replied simply. Vance laughed again, louder this time. "Substantial? That's generous. It's probably more than he makes in 6 months. He glanced around the table, enjoying the moment. "Careful, Owen. You might have to start washing dishes tonight." More laughter. Dia finally spoke, her voice tight with irritation. "Owen, stop. You're embarrassing yourself." But Owen didn't look at her. He didn't look at any of them. Instead, he reached slowly into his wallet. For a brief second, his fingers hovered there, brushing against worn leather, against years of habit, against everything he had carried without question. And then he felt it, the smooth, unfamiliar weight of the black card. He pulled it out and held it between his fingers. It looked the same as it always had. Matte black, no logo, no explanation, just a name engraved in silver, Clement Farrow. For 16 years, it had been nothing more than a mystery, a memory, a quiet echo of a man who had once told him, "When you use it, they'll know exactly who you are." Owen exhaled, slowly. Then he handed the card to the waiter. "Use this." The waiter took it with practiced ease, glancing down casually, and then he froze. The change was immediate, subtle, but unmistakable. His posture stiffened, his expression shifted, the color drained slightly from his face as his eyes moved from the card to Owen and back again. "Sir," the waiter said quietly, his voice no longer casual. "Please excuse me for a moment." He turned quickly and walked away, disappearing through the door at the far end of the room. For the first time that night, the laughter didn't return right away, because something no one could quite say what had just changed. The room didn't return to normal after the waiter left. The laughter faded into something uncertain, thinner, as if even the people who had mocked Owen moments ago could sense that something unusual was unfolding. Conversations resumed, but they lacked their earlier confidence. A few glances were cast toward the door where the waiter had disappeared. Time stretched in a way that made every second feel deliberate. Then the door opened. The waiter stepped back into the room, but he wasn't alone this time. Behind him walked a man who carried authority without needing to announce it. He was older, dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit, his posture straight, his expression composed but serious. A small name tag caught the light. Mr. Dunor, General Manager. The shift in energy was immediate. Even those who didn't know who he was instinctively understood that this was not a routine interruption. He didn't address the table. He walked directly to Owen. Stopping beside him, Mr. Dunor extended his hand with a level of respect that had never once been offered to Owen in that room. "Mr. Briggs," he said, his voice calm but formal, "I sincerely apologize for the delay." Owen stood, slightly caught off guard, and shook his hand. "That's all right." But Vance leaned forward, irritation breaking through his earlier confidence. "Excuse me," he said sharply. "What exactly is going on here?" Mr. Dunor didn't even glance in his direction. His attention remained fixed entirely on Owen. "Sir," he continued, lowering his voice just enough to create tension, yet loud enough for everyone to hear, "we have confirmed your identity with the estate's legal representatives." A ripple of confusion moved across the table. Owen frowned slightly. "My identity?" Mr. Dunor nodded. "Yes, sir. Your uncle's instructions were very clear. In the event that this card was presented, all protocols were to be activated immediately." The word protocols hung in the air, heavy and unexplained. Owen felt his pulse quicken. What protocols? For the first time, Mr. Dunor allowed a faint, respectful smile. "Sir, your uncle, Clement Farrow, was the founder of Farrow Hospitality Group." Silence. Not the casual silence of conversation ending, but the kind that arrives when reality itself shifts. Mr. Dunor continued, his tone steady. "He built this company over 4 decades into one of the most prestigious hospitality groups in the country. The Winthrop is our flagship location. In addition, the group operates 37 restaurants and 12 luxury hotels." No one moved. No one spoke. Owen felt like the words were landing around him rather than on him, as if they belonged to someone else. "I didn't know any of this," he said quietly. "That was intentional," Mr. Dunor replied. "Your uncle chose to remain private. Upon his passing 3 years ago, full ownership of the company was transferred to you. However, he left strict instructions that you were not to be informed until you chose to use the card." He paused, then added the sentence that shattered everything completely. "Mr. Briggs, you are now the sole owner of Farrow Hospitality Group." The silence broke not into sound, but into reaction. Vance's hand froze midair, his wineglass trembling slightly before he lowered it. His face, once filled with smug certainty, now held something else entirely: disbelief, struggling against reality. "That's impossible," he muttered. Lorraine's composed expression cracked, her eyes widening as she looked between Owen and the manager, searching for any sign that this was some kind of elaborate mistake. Hollis stared openly, his usual arrogance gone, replaced by something raw and unguarded. His phone slipped from his fingers, forgotten. And Dia looked at Owen as if she were seeing him for the very first time. Mr. Dunor, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, continued. "As of this morning's valuation, your net worth exceeds $400 million. The number landed like a shockwave. 400 million. It echoed in the room, not spoken again, but felt by everyone present. The same people who had laughed at him, dismissed him, reduced him to nothing now sat frozen, their understanding of him collapsing in real time. The air itself seemed different. Heavy, charged, uncertain. Because in a matter of seconds, Owen had gone from being the least important person in the room to the most powerful one. And for the first time, in 8 years, no one was laughing. For a long moment, Owen said nothing. He stood there, the weight of the revelation still settling into the room, watching as the same people who had dismissed him now struggled to even meet his eyes. The shift was undeniable. Respect, forced, sudden, and hollow, had replaced the casual cruelty they had worn so comfortably just minutes ago. But Owen didn't feel triumph. He felt clarity. His gaze moved slowly across the table, taking in every face. Vance, no longer leaning back with confidence, now sat rigid, his jaw tight. Lorraine's polite composure had dissolved into unease. Hollis avoided eye contact entirely. And Dia, she looked at him with something fragile, something uncertain, as if trying to rewrite everything she thought she knew. "Owen," she finally said, her voice softer now, stripped of its earlier coldness. "Why didn't you tell me?" Owen met her eyes, calm but distant. "I didn't know," he replied. Then, after a brief pause, he added quietly, "But let me ask you something. Would it have mattered?" She hesitated. That was answer enough. A faint, almost bitter smile touched Owen's lips, not out of anger, but out of understanding. "You handed me divorce papers 10 minutes ago," he continued. "Not because of who I am, but because of what you thought I didn't have." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every word landed with more weight than any shout ever could. He turned slightly, addressing the rest of the table. "For 8 years, all of you decided my worth before you ever bothered to know me. You measured me by numbers, by appearances, by things that have nothing to do with who a person actually is." No one interrupted. No one dared. "I sat at this table and listened to your jokes," he went on. "I watched you laugh at my work, at my life, at everything that mattered to me. And not once did any of you stop to consider that maybe. Just maybe. The problem wasn't me." Vance shifted in his seat, his voice finally breaking through, though it lacked its former authority. "Now hold on." "No," Owen said firmly, cutting him off. It was the first time he had ever done that. And it was enough. "You don't get to speak now," Owen continued, his eyes locking onto Vance's. "Not after everything you've said to me over the years. Not after tonight." Vance fell silent. Owen took a step forward, not aggressive, but grounded, sure of himself, in a way he had never been before. "You told me I'd be homeless by February," he said. "That I'd have nothing." A brief pause. "Funny thing about that," he added quietly. "Because, according to the records your own lawyers would recognize, the building your dealership operates in is owned by Faro Properties." The realization hit Vance instantly. His expression shifted again, this time into something closer to fear. "That makes me your landlord." The words didn't need emphasis. They carried themselves. Owen let the silence linger just long enough for it to sink in before continuing. "So no, I won't be the one leaving in February." He straightened slightly, his voice calm, controlled, final. "You will." No one moved. No one spoke. The balance of power had not just shifted, it had reversed completely. But Owen wasn't finished. He looked back at Dia one last time, his expression softening but only slightly. "I loved you," he said. "I meant every promise I made. I would have spent my life building something real with you, no matter how long it took." There was no anger in his tone now, just truth. "But you didn't want that," he continued. "You wanted something easier, something that looked better from the outside." Dia's eyes filled, but Owen didn't stop. "And now that you think I have everything, it suddenly matters again." He shook his head faintly. "That's not love." The words settled between them, quiet but absolute. Owen glanced once more around the table at the people who had spent years defining him without ever understanding him. "You all thought I was nothing," he said. "But the truth is, I never needed your approval to be worth something." He reached for his coat, slipping it on with calm precision. "Tonight didn't change who I am," he added. "It just revealed who all of you really are." And with that, Owen turned away, not in anger, not in haste, but with the quiet certainty of a man who had finally taken back something no one else had the right to define: himself. The days after that Christmas night unfolded with a quiet finality Owen hadn't expected. There were no dramatic confrontations, no long arguments, no attempts to salvage what had already been broken beyond repair. He returned to the house he had once shared with Dia, packed only what he needed, and left before she came back. Not out of anger, but because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been made clear. The divorce moved quickly. Ironically, the prenuptial agreement that Vance had once insisted on, designed to protect the Thornberry family's wealth, worked perfectly in reverse. Dia walked away with exactly what she had expected Owen to have. Nothing. No claim, no share, no leverage. Just the consequences of a decision made when she believed he had no value. At first, there were attempts to reach him. Dia called one evening, her voice softer than he had ever heard it, stripped of pride and certainty. She said she had made a mistake, that she hadn't understood what she had, that she still loved him. Owen listened in silence, letting her finish. And then, calmly, he told her the truth. "You didn't lose me because I had nothing," he said. "You lost me because you believed I was nothing." There was no anger in his voice, only clarity. He ended the call, and with it, any remaining connection to the life they had once shared. Others followed. Lorene sent a letter filled with apologies, carefully worded explanations, and invitations to start over. Hollis reached out with sudden friendliness, talking about business ideas, about opportunities, about how they could work together now. Owen ignored them all. Some bridges, once burned, are not meant to be rebuilt, not because of bitterness, but because of understanding. As for Vance, the man who had once stood at the head of every table with absolute confidence, his world began to shift in ways he could not control. Within months, the lease on his primary dealership location was not renewed. Business declined. 2 of his locations closed within the year. The same man who had mocked Owen for working with his hands now struggled to hold together the empire he had once used as a measure of superiority. Owen didn't celebrate any of it. He simply moved forward. Taking over Faro Hospitality was not what people expected. He didn't isolate himself behind glass offices or surround himself with layers of authority. Instead, he walked through his restaurants, visited his hotels, spoke to the people who kept everything running. He learned names. He listened. He paid attention. To him, leadership wasn't about power. It was about responsibility. And despite everything he had inherited, he didn't let it change the core of who he was. On weekends, he still returned to his workshop. The same worn tools, the same quiet space, the same process of restoring what others had discarded. Because that part of his life had never been about money, it had always been about meaning. In the end, Owen didn't become someone new. He simply stopped trying to prove himself to people who were never willing to see him. And in doing so, he became something far more powerful than anything they had ever valued, not just successful, but certain of his own worth, without needing anyone else to define it. About a year after that night, on a quiet afternoon in his workshop, Owen came across something he hadn't expected. He had been restoring an old oak table, carefully sanding down its surface, when he noticed a small hidden drawer at the back, sealed shut by time and neglect. Curious, he pried it open, revealing a single envelope inside, yellowed at the edges, untouched for years. His name was written on the front in a familiar hand. Owen paused before opening it, already knowing who it was from. Clément. He unfolded the letter slowly, the paper fragile beneath his fingers, and began to read. "Owen, if you're reading this, it means you finally used the card. I never told you about the money, because I wanted you to become a good man on your own. Anyone can be kind when they have everything. The real test is who you are when you have nothing." Owen felt his chest tighten as he continued. "I watched you. I saw how you worked, how you treated people, how you carried yourself when no one was there to reward you for it. You didn't change, even when the world gave you every reason to. That's why I left everything to you, not because you needed it, but because you earned it in the only way that truly matters." The words settled deep, filling a space Owen hadn't realized was still searching for answers. "Remember this," the letter went on. "The people who stand by you when you have nothing are the only ones worth standing beside when you have everything. Money reveals people. It doesn't define them." Owen lowered the letter, staring at the worn wood in front of him, letting the meaning sink in. For so long he had allowed others to measure him by standards that were never truly his. He had questioned his worth because he didn't fit into their version of success. But Clement had seen what no one else had bothered to look for: character, integrity, quiet strength. That Christmas night hadn't made him valuable. It had simply revealed what had been there all along. Owen folded the letter carefully, holding it for a moment before placing it back into the drawer. A small smile crossed his face, not of victory, but of understanding. Because in the end, Clement had been right. A person's worth is not measured by what they own, but by who they choose to be, especially when no one is watching.